So what I want to do today is, I'm assuming that we've all been following the situation in Gaza over the last 16, nearly 17 months, and that we're all fairly well aware of the extent of the atrocities and the devastation and the suffering which has been caused there. And so I'm going to take a lot of that knowledge for granted. I mean, there are lots of ways in which you can obviously build it up. And what I'm going to do really is to address the issue of genocide, the analysis of genocide, the crime of genocide in this particular case, and to do that by looking at both legal and more socio-historical perspectives on genocide, and by looking also in a little bit more depth at the historical perspective of Palestine. So could we have the next slide, please? Let's see. No. So I thought I'd start just, as by way of summary. These are the charges that Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor of the ICC, asked judges to issue warrants on, and he brought that to the judges last May. A lot of people said that was already rather late because it was, 8 months or something into what was going on. And it took another 6 months for the ICC judges to issue warrants, but they have issued warrants for Netanyahu and his former defense minister. And it's a pretty damning set of indictments. It's a strong, multi-focused list. It's very interesting that it starts with the item of starvation and the restriction of food supply into Gaza, which is now extensively documented, and which all the aid organizations have long complained about, and which has varied a little bit over the course of the year, because at times in response to international pressure, Israel has let up a little bit on the restriction, but then they have doubled down on it. So, and it's interesting to mention that because, of course, that is also the nub of the case that South Africa has brought to the International Court of Justice, and especially it is the core of the instructions which the ICJ has issued to Israel, and which, of course, they have not seriously acted on. So it's interesting, really, that is what has come out to the fore in the ICJ, and it's at the top of the list of Karim Khan's charges. But really, the other charges are also very important, and we have here a comprehensive set of allegations against Israel, which, in the case of virtually any other state, I think would have led to very strong responses from Western governments, but we know that they haven't. So perhaps we could move on. So what I meant to say before we moved on, but I can say it now, because it's of course, the one thing that was missing from that slide was a charge of genocide. The ICC has not charged Israel's leaders with crimes relating to genocide. And you might think that in a way that is a proportionate move from the point of view of the court, because of the enormous negative feedback that they have received, not only from Israel but also from the United States, in the light of the charges they have already brought. But I think it's still a glaring omission. It's possible. I mean, I'm not privy to the workings of the ICC. It's possible that there may be genocide charges to come. It was very noticeable that when the judges agreed to the warrants, the statement that the ICC issued talked about a systematic attack by Israel on the civilian population of Gaza. And that idea of systematic attack suggested something more than the individual crimes that were listed on the previous slide. So, and it echoes this which is Raphael Lemkin's original statement about the idea of genocide in 1933, when he took a proposal for a new international crime or he tried to take this proposal to a conference in Madrid. And this was how he explained it. He says, all these different types of violence, massacres, pogroms, actions undertaken to ruin the economic existence of the members of a collectivity, all of these were part of his original idea. All sorts of brutalities, which have their source in a campaign of extermination directed against the collectivity. So he says there are all these different types of violence, but what constitutes, what brings out the idea of genocide is to take these different actions as a whole, to see them as in a combined sense, just to ask what, if we look overall at this set of crimes, or we might say if we look overall at the list of crimes in the charges brought by the ICC against Netanyahu, what are we talking about? We are talking about a holistic crime. And so Lemkin is proposing the idea of genocide right at the start in 1933. In fact, he's not even calling it genocide at this stage, he's calling it barbarity. He calls it genocide a decade later. As a way of looking at the crimes that a state or other armed power commits against the civilian population in a holistic way. So that what genocide brings out is the question of whether a state can be said to have a holistic destructive policy towards a particular civilian collectivity or group or population. And so he's arguing that we should have this holistic approach. And he says that taking separately the acts he refers to here, but this would also apply to the ICC charges, are punishable in the respective codes. So we have the codes of war crimes and crimes against humanity, but considered together, they should constitute offences against the law of nations by reason of their common feature, which is to endanger the existence of the collectivity concerned. And he says the entire social order, by which he means, if you like, what we might call the global order. So he's suggesting that we need to look at crimes of violence and destruction against civilian groups in a holistic sense, and to ask this question: is there a holistic policy? If we have the next slide, please. No, we're on the same one. We're not. You pressed the arrow, I think. No? Will it not go back and forward? It's stuck. Well, all right. Well, oh, you have. Right. Okay. Yeah. So before I come to Israel, I wanted to just to bring this back to everyone's attention again. I'm assume this is something with which you are familiar. The Genocide Convention and the key articles of the convention, but that you were, I think, familiar with this article. So it seems to me that prima facie Israel has committed these acts, which are acts criminalized by the convention: the killing of the members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, and deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction, at least in part. And in a situation where, as we know, it's come out in the last week or so that the average life expectancy in Gaza has halved in the last 16 months. The Gaza now has virtually the lowest life expectancy of anywhere in the world, whereas previously it had, a much more average sort of life expectancy. There is little doubt that the conditions of life which Israel has inflicted on the population of Gaza could be seen as calculated to bring about their physical destruction, at least in part, as the convention says. Also worth, before I leave this, I put up this article as well, which perhaps is less referred to. So it's not only genocide, committing genocide, which is outlawed by this convention, it's also conspiracy to commit it. Direct and public incitement to commit it is also outlawed, and of course there is a huge evidence of that from Israel's leaders, from Israel's media, from Israel's soldiers, from all sorts of corners, and the attempt to commit genocide, and complicity in genocide is also outlawed. And really, this could well lead us to consider the role, first of all, of the United States and the United States under President Biden, which continued to arm Israel at a massive scale, including the bombs which were needed for the sort of campaign that they were waging. There were one or two points at which they were slightly interrupted, but basically the flow of arms has continued throughout, as well as huge financial and political support, international political support throughout. And not only, of course, would the United States government or Biden or Blinken, people like that, be in the line here, but also the governments of countries like Germany, which provides very large, the second largest proportion of Israel's arms, the United Kingdom, which provides a fairly small proportion, but some very key parts, for example, for the F-35 bombers, which Israel uses to bomb Gaza, and which the United Kingdom government refused to include in its sanctions. When it did introduce sanctions against Israel, it refused to include these because of their effects on or their importance for the international F-35 program. So these governments at least, I think, and many others in different ways, could be said to be complicit, and indeed other actors as well. But we won't go into the full scale of the complicity, although it is, of course, it's a big question, because this is a genocide which, unlike virtually all the other genocides of recent decades, has been carried out by what we can regard as a Western state, a major ally of the North Atlantic group of states, and with their support. So we could raise all sorts of questions about the complicity of Western countries, and indeed, of course, of other states in other genocides. But in this case, the involvement is much stronger and often direct. So perhaps we could move on again. Now, before we leave the sort of definitional level, I wanted just to bring in, because in my work I operate with slightly different definitions from Lemkin's and the conventions. I draw on Lemkin's, and I draw in a sense on the conventions. But I have this range of definitions. So I talk about genocidal action as action in which armed power organizations treat civilian social groups as enemies and aim to destroy their real or putative social power. And I use this terminology because it isn't only states that can commit genocide. Other sorts of armed actors, armed political actors. And it isn't only ethnic and national groups, or ethnic, national, racial and religious groups, as the convention says, that may be targeted. So I adopt a broad definition referring to social groups. And I take into account the fact that these forces which commit genocide may sometimes have fantastical ideas of their target populations, so they impute certain sort of power to them. So I talk about putative as well as real social power. And I also talk about the conflict which arises from genocide as a part of the definition of the phenomenon as from a social point of view. So I see genocide as a type of war, a particular illegitimate type of war, in fact, which has many similarities with conventional war, with war which is in principle legitimate or legal, but which is a war directed at civilian social groups rather than at another armed enemy. And so that's a core aspect of my distinction. Now, obviously, talking about genocide in that way brings our attention to the fact that what we call war and what we call genocide are actually often very closely connected and combined. The Holocaust took place during the Second World War as part of Nazi Germany's war against the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. The Rwandan genocide took place as part of the civil war between the Rwandan regime and the Rwanda Patriotic Front, and so on. So genocides typically take place in the context of more conventional wars. And of course, this is something very relevant to Gaza, because Israel is fighting a war against Hamas, as well as, in my view, committing genocide against the civilian population of Gaza. The two things have gone very closely together, intimately combined, I would say, perhaps unusually intimately combined. Most genocidal regimes have much more separate, more distinct campaigns against their civilian social enemies, even if they carry these out as part of their military campaign. It's easier to distinguish them. In this case, really from the start of Israel's bombing in October 2023, which of course was within 48 hours of Hamas's attacks, I believe that Israel was essentially carrying out a campaign against the civilian population as well as against Hamas, and using the same methodology. So, although the ICC charges are headed by the crime of starvation, the campaign that Israel has waged against the civilian population of Gaza started with the bombing. The policies of restricting aid evolved over the months afterwards, but it started with the bombing, the massive bombing of civilian areas, on the pretext of targeting individual Hamas leaders or officials, and under the rubric of what Francesca Albanese calls humanitarian camouflage, the bending of the laws of war to allow 100 or so or dozens of civilians to be killed with the ostensible aim of targeting the one Hamas fighter. So there is a war in Gaza, but it's in my view, it's a genocidal war. It's a very particular kind of genocidal war, in some ways distinct from others. Some other terminology that these are the definitions you'll find in my book. I could expand on them in various ways, but I just want. So I think that what Israel has done fits this category, but I also have this category, the category of genocidal violence. Now, some of you may be aware that the anthropologist Leo Cooper proposed the category of genocidal massacre as a way. In a way, it's a variant of what the Genocide Convention calls genocide in part, destroying a population or a group in part. So he says that genocidal massacre, which may be localized, which may be targeting part of a group, can be seen as a distinct manifestation of genocide. So I suppose an example would be the Srebrenica massacre in Bosnia 30 years ago, which was a major event and has been actually considered a genocide in its own right, but really was part of a larger genocide in Bosnia-Herzegovina over several years. But it's important that to be able to pick out these sorts of events. And so I'm generalizing his category by talking about genocidal violence, because I think we could also talk about genocidal expulsions, genocidal mass rape, and we could talk about genocidal hostage taking. So in my view, what has been happening in Gaza in the last period is a combination of genocidal massacres and hostage taking committed by Hamas, because Hamas attacked the civilian population of southern Israel because they were and killed and took them hostage because they were Israelis. That fits the idea of a genocidal massacre. So it's a combination of a genocidal massacre followed by a much larger scale episode of genocide, a much more sustained genocide committed by a very powerful state, because obviously Hamas action would took place on one day, and it was very localized, very limited, and although Israel made a mess of dealing with it, they and in some ways aggravated it, they did contain it within a few days. Israel has been really uncontained largely unconstrained, not entirely, but largely, for all this period. Could we have the next slide, please? So what I would argue we have had in actually, just to pick up again, to take further the point about the last 16 months. I think what we've had in the last period, in this period, is what I would call a counter-genocidal war, in the sense that the limited genocidal massacres committed by Hamas have provoked Israel into this much more massive, larger scale, sustained genocide. That is actually a pattern which we find quite a lot in history. If we look at, for example, the so-called Indian Mutiny of 1857, when Indians rose up against the British Raj, the British Empire in India, and there were notorious cases where the Indian rebels killed and attacked British civilians, British men and women, and these became iconic in the representations of this event in Britain for a century or so. They remained very resonant. But what actually happened is that after these atrocities committed by the rebels, the British then killed tens of thousands of Indians and visited vastly greater genocidal massacres on the civilians. Another example, these are historical examples, there are more recent ones, but I won't burden you with too many, is the genocide in German Southwest Africa in 1904-5, which began with attacks by the Herero people, who were colonized people, on the German civilian population as well as on the German military, and the German Empire responded with massive scale violence against the colonial people, and which largely wiped them out, and then contained the remainder of the population in concentration camps. So this is something that happened. What had happened in Palestine in Gaza in the last period is, it's maybe something which we haven't seen in quite this scale in this sort of context in recent times, but it resonates with a lot of historical understanding. And of course, this brings me to looking at the larger structural context of this, because a lot of people would say, even people who regard what Israel is doing as genocide would say, oh, you can't talk about how Hamas helped to trigger this genocide with its actions because there is this longer history. Well, there is this longer history. This doesn't this doesn't take away from the specificity of the events which have occurred in the last 16 months and the role that Hamas's attacks played in that. But that Hamas obviously took those actions, didn't take them out of the blue, it took them as the culmination of this whole conflict. And I was one of the first people to say in October 2023 that what Israel was doing was genocide. And I also introduced this idea of genocidal massacres to describe Hamas's actions at a time when a lot of other scholars, as well as international organizations, were not prepared to make that judgment. Since then, that has happened on a much bigger scale. I also was one of the first people to argue that we should look at Palestine in a genocide perspective, and I did this in an article 15 years ago, 2010. And I think that perspective has also been validated because it is now much more common, just because of what has happened in the last 16 months. People are re-evaluating what had happened beforehand. So just to summarize my argument without going into too much detail, obviously, I think that as a settler colonial project, which Zionist colonization of Palestine was, this entailed genocidal potential. Many examples of settler colonialism, this is a standard theme of the recent literature, have entailed the removal or the destruction, either the removal or the physical destruction or some sort of combination of the two, of the indigenous populations. That has been seen as a specifically settler colonial rather than a general, if you like, imperial colonial phenomenon. And I think we can argue that was built into, in a sense, the possibility of that, not the necessity, not the certainty of it, but the possibility of it was built into the Zionist project. And this, I've got this quote here from Benny Morris, an Israeli historian who now, in fact, or at the time he wrote this, justifies this project, that the idea of transferring the Palestinian population out of Palestine was built into the whole Zionist project. So I call, in 2010, I call this an incipiently genocidal ideology. An ideology which could lead in the direction of genocide. It didn't necessarily have to. It would depend, obviously, on the circumstances. And I think it's important to think about how the Israel-Palestine situation fits into the wider perspective on colonial genocide, because it's often compared, the Palestine situation is often compared to, for example, the colonization of North America or Australia. I think it's actually rather different from that. It's similar, obviously, in the basic dynamics, but it's different in all sorts of important contextual ways. Not only the drivers of Zionist colonization, which were really the persecution of the Jews in Eastern Europe, and the idea of the Jews as a separate nation, which didn't really happen with most settler colonies. Most settler colonies, the colonists went there as part of a larger empire, and then after they got there, eventually they got to the idea that they could be a separate nation, like, the United States or Canada or whatever. In this case, they had the idea of the nation state right from the start, because they were coming out of this context of Eastern European nationalism, where every nation worth its salt was trying to carve out its own state and to expel and remove other peoples. And of course, the situation, the key difference really between Israel and many other cases is that this happened so late. This happened after nationalism had spread to the colonial world. after national movements had arisen in other colonial countries. So if we talk about the colonization of North America or Australia, that was in a period when that sort of nationalism didn't exist. But of course, by the time the Zionists really get going in the first half of the 20th century, the nationalisms of the oppressed in the colonial world are on the rise, including in the Arab world. So there's plenty. So really, the distinctiveness is really that Israel was competing, or the project of Israel, the Zionist project, was competing with the project of an independent Palestine for the Palestinians from more or less from the start. And that's unlike, and the other thing, of course, is distinctive is that unlike there are other cases like that. You think of South Africa, for example, but in South Africa, eventually, the settler colonial state gave way and allowed the indigenous national movement to take over. You think of Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, where the colonists were defeated. You think of Algeria, where France fought a war to defeat the national movement and to protect the colonists' power, but the colonists in the end lost, and France lost, and then the colonists were mostly left. So Israel is unique in the sense that here the colonists hung on. They got their state, they armed it to the teeth, and they had this massive backing, not just from an old colonial power, but from the new superpower, and to some extent the whole range of major powers. Other obviously big difference, Jews themselves the victims of genocide, which means that the idea of genocide has been present in the Palestine conflict from, well, not from the start, obviously, because it started before the genocide of the Jews, but since the 1940s, the 1930s, 1940s, when the Jews were subjected to the most severe persecution and then complete physical extermination in Europe. That's the period in which the Zionist project really gathered final momentum and was able to take over. And so I see, in a sense, the Nakba, the mass expulsions of Palestinians in 1948, which created the huge refugee camps in Gaza, which were the main part of the Palestinian population there, and as well as in the West Bank, so including some which are now being cleared by the Israeli army. This actually is really the realization of this structural potential. And I mean, we haven't got time to talk about the whole history, obviously, but a lot of people have talked about slow motion genocide of the Palestinians in the intervening period. There has been a whole process of dispossession. And so the occupation, I think, has to be brought under a lot of scrutiny really here as the fulcrum of the destruction of Palestinian society. So yeah, obviously armed resistance, some political polarization, increasing that. But maybe couple more minutes and then we should move on then. Okay, I'll try yes, as quickly as possible. Oh dear, sorry. I see. All right. Oh, so this is what Lemkin said about occupation. So I think it's no accident really that these questions are coming home to roost, because really this was the context in which Lemkin dreamt up the idea of well, not the context in which he originally dreamt it up in 1933, but the context in which he finalized it in 1944 in his book on the German occupation of Europe. And these sort of statements, I think, resonate very much with what has been happening in Palestine, and this dilemma here, for the occupier. Do they impose their national pattern on the oppressed population, which is allowed to remain, or do they remove it? Well, that is really Israel's dilemma, and of course, we've seen the movement towards the removal as a main feature of recent weeks. Last slide, I think. Yes, last slide. All right. Well, this is really just summarizing what I've already said. Uh, yeah, this is. If we leave this up, then people can take it in, and I don't have to say it all. Um, what I would just want to emphasize is this: that forced removal, which of course is what Israel has been driving towards increasingly over the last 6 months, and what Trump has supercharged with his interventions. I regard this as a method of genocide in general. So I think the Nakba was genocidal because the removal of the population is the destruction of the society, in a certain sense, an important sense. But in this context, in the context of this genocidal war that's been going on for 16 months already, the removal of the population is a final method of genocide. It's a completion of the genocide, which has already been largely accomplished by other means. So I'll stop there. And
Okay.
yeah.
All right. So we're going to move to questions.